international field today with Thomas Warner from Brazil, presenting his work on the relationship between financial and sporting performance of professional football clubs. Before he takes away his presentation, just the usual reminder that at the end of this series, just before Christmas, we have an opportunity to meet in person. We've got the second Reading Football Economics Workshop. Football will be interpreted very liberally, as will economics as well, for that matter. If you are interested in an in-person conference, obviously it's great to keep going with these online sessions. They seem to serve a good purpose, but it's also very nice to meet in person. And so we have a conference lined up for the 13th and 14th December, the 2 days of the World Cup semi-finals, if you want to orientate yourself. If you want to submit a paper, please do so. I will put the link into the chat, and I'll also put a link to the website as well if you are willing and able to join us here in Reading in a few weeks' time. But I don't want to take any of Thomas's time away from him. So Thomas, please do take away your talk.
Okay, Professor James, let me just share my screen here. Right. Is it sharing?
You're sharing your Teams window.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yeah, that's your presentation.
Right. So the title of this working paper is The Relationship Between Financial and Sporting Performance of Professional Football Clubs, Empirical Evidence from Brazilian Football. And this paper, it was derived from my dissertation thesis in the post-graduation program or in applied economics in the Federal University of Ouro, Preto. I have to thank here my supervisors, Carlos Eduardo and from UFOP, and also Igor Viveiros, who was my co-supervisor, who is a lecturer at UFMG, which is the Federal University of Minas Gerais State, and is where I actually did my graduation. I have to thank also my colleague, Gabriel, who helped me out with the presentation, and thank Professor James Reade for the invitation to present this paper here. So here we have a brief summary of what is going to be presented along during this presentation. We're going to start with a brief introduction about Brazilian football, because I wouldn't expect most of you are familiar with the structure and the whole sporting context in Brazil. Also, I'm going to pass on to financial variables and sporting performance and what the literature and economic literature has researched about this. And I'll describe afterwards the empirical strategy, the results, and end with the final considerations. Right. So to start, we have to talk a little bit about Brazilian football, which it's not really similar to local European leagues, where there's a traditional domination of a few clubs. Brazil is a continental country, so it has very big metropolitan areas and spaced out in the country. So you have at least 12 very big teams with huge followings. I'd say here the four teams from São Paulo State, the 4 teams from Rio de Janeiro, the 2 teams from Minas Gerais, which is where I'm from, and 2 teams from Rio Grande do Sul, but we have in Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul. But we have to mention also teams from the Northeast, from the state of Bahia, in Salvador, Fortaleza, which is a big metropolitan area with 2 big clubs also, and also Recife, which they have at least three large clubs. So here we present the number of league titles between 2003 and 2021 for the 5 main leagues in Europe and the Brazilian league. And what we can see is that the time frame was selected because before 2003 Brazil had didn't have a league tournament. It was all a knockouts. So the comparison is easier to do in this time frame. So what we can see here is the Premier League of the European leagues is the most, let's say, competitive with the diversity of champions, but still it's pretty concentrated between Man United, Chelsea and Man City, although Man United haven't won for ages now. League One, PSG, traditional domination. La Liga, we have Barcelona, Real Madrid winning most of the titles. In the Bundesliga, Bayern Munich are far and away the most victorious. And in Serie A, in Italy, it's very rare that we have a champion outside of the big three. So in Brazilian football, what we see is a very big rotation in champions and in success in the teams. Even if you look at in Copa Libertadores, which would be the equivalent of the Champions League, the amount of champions they change a lot, and it's very competitive. And this structure in Brazil has created a very fierce competition amongst the teams. Right, and after the 2014 World Cup, Brazilian football and the whole of Brazil has been went through a big modernization in infrastructure. So Brazilian teams had to improve their infrastructure, their training grounds, their stadiums, and the whole of Brazil had to invest in infrastructures with new motorways, new metros, and so on. So we see here the graph of the evolution of total and recurring revenues of Brazilian football in billion reais. What we see here that up to 2014, there's a slight growth up to 2013. Sorry, there's a slight growth, and then there's a small depression. But after that, the revenues have been soaring, and in some parts it's due to this the increase in prices of tickets and the increase in merchandise, broadcast revenue, and also sales of athletes. The recurring revenue excludes the sales of athletes because it's not a constant source of revenue. So it's a way to deduct only the constant revenue, let's say. So this time frame is interesting in Brazil because it's a very competitive league and a competitive environment, sporting environment, and also this research, covers a period where Brazilian football went through a modernization, and also the available data only became available after and along the World Cup, because Brazil, like I said, the football in Brazil was almost amateur. And since the World Cup, it's started to professionalize, let's say, with businessmen running the clubs and actual corporate finance techniques used in the business structure. An example here that I'd like to show is the Stadium Mineirão, which is the local stadium. It's the stadium where Germany beat Brazil 7-1. This is what it looked like before the World Cup. You see, it looks like the Kop, what English stadiums used to call the Kop, with no chairs in the stadium, loads and loads of people in the stadium. This stadium actually put in 130,000 people in one of the games in 1997, if I'm not mistaken. It's a record. And nowadays it looks like this, and it fits 61,000 people. So it's been modernized. I'd say it even resembles a European stadium with the whole structure and the entertainment that you have around it. And of course, this has produced an increase in prices of tickets, and it's reflected in the more income coming into the football clubs. Right. So having said that, its research is aimed to analyze the relationship between financial variables and sporting performance in Brazil. And what most of the literature has stated is that sports performance and has a positive influence on revenues. Like there have been very diverse researchers and different researchers, sorry, that have analyzed this, including Szymanski and Smith, Szymanski's and Cooper's book in 1999, and the Barajas as well, who analyzed Spanish football, and the statistical methods and the samples have been very different, but the conclusions have been the same, that sports performance has a positive influence on revenues of football clubs. And the same way, payroll seems to have a positive influence on sports performance. Szymanski has mentioned that in diverse publications. Hall also analyzing baseball and English football, and some other research. But these research have come to the conclusion that payroll has a positive influence on sports performance, and sports performance has a positive influence on revenues, and with not much discussion. But financial results in forms of profits is more ambiguous in relation to sports performance. Some researchers like Szymanski and Smith, Szymanski and Coopers, they found that there was that there wasn't really any statistical significance between the variables. Barajas, analyzing Spanish football, found similar conclusions. Golu as well, analyzing Turkish football, found no correlation between the variables. Although some other papers, like some more recent, like Ferhi in 2017, analyzed Italian football, and he found that there was a significant and positive influence of financial results on the sports performance of Italian football clubs. Ferreira and Pereira also found that sports performance influenced positively profits in form of ROA, return over assets, or EBIT, which is earnings before interest and tax. But at the same time, Sanchez more recently found that there was a significant but negative influence of financial results on sporting performance. So these mentioned research, they have analyzed the influence of sport performance on financial results, or of financial results on sport performance. Only Sanchez recently has investigated the simultaneous relationship between these two variables. And because these two variables are determined simultaneously at the same time, it creates a form of endogeneity, to the estimation of the regression, which has to be analyzed. And Sanchez addressed this issue, estimating a system of simultaneous equations, one with sporting performance as a dependent variable, and the other equation with financial performance as the dependent variable. He used ROA, which is return over assets, and he used the method of three-stage least squares to estimate this this system, and the result of Sanchez showed that there is a simultaneity bias in the estimation by ordinary least squares. So the three-stage least squares is more efficient to be analyzed in this situation. Right. Here we come to the sample that I used. Differently to the work of Sanchez, this paper analyzed teams from the same country. Sanchez analyzed teams from all over Europe, the main clubs in Europe. This research is concentrated for Brazilian football, like the title said, and the data for these teams was extracted from the Itaú BBA Economic Financial Analysis reports, and it wasn't published regularly, but I managed to gather these 4 reports here from 2015, 16, 18, and 20. They've actually discontinued this project and passed it on to another bank. Itaú is the biggest bank in Brazil. They've passed this project on to XP, which is another financial institution. So the data might be more regular in the future. And these reports covers the period between 2013 and 2019 for 26 Brazilian football clubs. And the clubs are depicted here in this table. So the data takes form of panel data, which combines cross-section with time series. So it's a let's say more efficient variation of data as it combines time, observations, and different units. Right. The variable selected here for the statistical approach of this paper were the following: return on assets, which is calculated by the ratio between net profit and total assets of the clubs. The sports performance index was extracted from CBF, which is the Brazilian FA performance rankings, and as always a relative measure, the sports performance variable was also divided by the number of points obtained by the team in the CBF ranking, by the number of points of the maximum observation of the sample in the year. This transformation is also performed by Ferri in his paper, and it's necessary because ROA is also a relative measure, and so sports performance is it's important for sports performance to be as well. The other variables, control variables or independent variables, are leverage, which measure the team's debt. It's calculated by the ratio between the total debt of the club by the total assets. The other variables are population, assets, costs, and expenses. These 3 variables were transformed logarithmically, so they were expressed in logarithms. This transformation is necessary to adjust the exponential character of the data, and also most of the related literature also does that. And the last independent variable is the modern stadium dummy, which as Brazil went through this modernization that I mentioned previously, we found it would be interesting to see what is the impact of having a modern stadium on the team's financial performance and sports performance. And so, as not all clubs have modernized their stadiums, it was only a few. Right. So here we have the descriptive statistics of the variables. We can see here that on average, Brazilian clubs have been having losses in the financial point of view, with on average a negative 0.04 return on assets. We see here that there have been some very bad situations with a negative 4.52 ROA, which is a big loss. Another interesting fact here is the debt of Brazilian football clubs, where on average, Brazilian football clubs are 88% of their assets in debt. So they owe 88% of their assets on average. This is possible because Brazilian football clubs have always been non-profit institutions, so they are not subject to bankruptcy, so they can be in debt and pay their debts in long term. So it's very different to some European situations. We see here the other variables, the standard deviations of the variables, the minimum and the maximum. Right. So we can carry on to the results of the estimated models. We estimated two equations, likewise Sanchez, and one model was estimated through ordinary least squares, and the other one through three-stage least squares. It's a very similar approach to what Sanchez did. And here we have, on the first equation, we have ROA as a dependent variable and standard performance as the other dependent variable of the system. And we use the Hausman test, like Sanchez as well, to analyze if there was any systematic difference between the estimated coefficients. And the Hausman test rejects the null hypothesis that there is no difference. So it indicates that the estimated coefficients through three-stage least squares are more efficient, and therefore there is a simultaneous relationship between the variables. So therefore, for this type of estimation through three-stage least squares, we require the use of instruments. Sanchez in his paper does not state clearly what instruments he used. So in my research, we had to investigate from other empirical work from other subjects, and most of the techniques used use instruments, use lag variables for instruments as instruments. And to analyze if the instruments are exogenous, we use the Hansen-Sagen test, which did not reject the null hypothesis that the instruments used are exogenous. So they corroborate the instruments used. Right. So having said that, I'm going to focus on the results for the model estimated by three-stage least squares. So what we can see here is that sporting performance has a positive and significant influence on ROA, which is the financial performance variable. So an increase in sporting performance increases your financial performance. This is a form of indication that the better the team's performance, the better the profits. So it would encourage, you would have thought it would encourage administrators to get better sporting performance, as is the aim of most football clubs. Right. The leverage performance, or the leverage variable, sorry, or debt, presented a negative and significant coefficient, indicated that the larger the debt of the football club, the less the profits. It decreases the profits. This is largely due to financial costs of the debt, where interest rates are very high in Brazil. So if you have a large debt, you're going to have a large expense on interest. So it's going to eat into your profits. The population variable did not show any significance in equation 1. So we cannot differentiate it from 0. The assets variable, presented a negative influence on ROA, negative and significant. This is not common, like in other research, in other papers. The asset variable showed that the larger the asset, the larger the profits, due to economies of scale. But in Brazil, the big clubs are in big debt, and like we saw in the descriptive statistics, so the large teams with the big teams with large assets, they are not presenting profits. It's some way ironic. So what we see here is that the big teams are not taking taking advantage of their assets to generate profits. The modern stadium variable did not present any significance statistically. So we're going to carry on to the sporting performance equation now, or equation 2. We see here that ROA has a positive and significant influence on sporting performance. So in the same way that sporting performance influences financial performance positively, financial performance also influences sporting performance. Yeah, so it's a simultaneous and direct relationship between the variables. Interestingly, also, leverage showed a positive and significant influence on sporting performance. This is probably due to the fact that the Brazilian football club's debt is composed a lot by the acquisition and salaries of players. It's very common in Brazil for teams to go 3 months without pay, and that money goes into the debt. So it's a form of indication that most teams are going into debt to generate sporting results. The population variable showed a negative and significant influence on sporting performance. This was also not expected, but it's interesting because it could be a sign of a small city team, where the small city and the hostile environment of visiting small teams in small cities produce a sporting benefit for these teams. And I give the example of Chapecoense and Santos, which play in very small hostile stadiums, and it's difficult to get there. You have to travel by bus most of the time, and this is a reflection of this, and this reflects on the worsening of sporting performance for teams from big towns in good stadiums, let's say. we had to make a small transformation in the asset variable due to multicollinearity between assets and cost and expenses, sorry. And but the asset variable does not vary much from a year from another. So this transformation was necessary to interpret this variable in the model. And what it shows is that the assets has a positive influence on the sporting performance. So therefore, the larger the team's asset, the better the sporting performance. So it's an indication that the big teams in Brazil have been winning the championships, and it is the case. And the cost and expenses variable also showed a positive and significant influence on sports performance. Likewise, most of the literature, so it demonstrates in some terms that the teams with the largest investments in the squad have a better sporting performance. And the stadium dummy did not show any significance either, statistical significance. And here both equations showed significance, so we can interpret them. The coefficients are all different from 0. And also the Brosh-Godfrey autocorrelation test did not indicate to the presence of any autocorrelation. Right, so having said that, we found some very interesting results here, because let me go back a little bit, because we see that leverage or debt shows different signals in the different signs, sorry, in the equation. So at the same time, it has a leverage has a negative effect on financial performance. It has a positive effect on sports performance. So as this is a simultaneous equation model, we try to understand what is the net effect of leverage on these variables. So we calculated the elasticities of the variables ROA and sporting performance with respect to leverage. And I'm not going to go into any mathematical specification, but the results found that a unitary variation in leverage generates a minus 0.09 reduction in ROA and in a minus 0.06 in sports performance. So what this means is that even though Brazilian football clubs have been going into debt to try and get their sports results, they have it's not a very good method, because in the long run they are going to have a financial loss and a sporting loss. And I'd like to highlight here the example of Cruzeiro, which is a team from my local town. And after two successful years winning the Brazilian Cup, Cruzeiro was in a terrible debt and was relegated. And it was one of the worst financial results of the history of Brazilian football. So they've stayed there for 3 years with year-on-year losses and with mediocre campaigns, even in the second division. And only now they've managed to resurrect themselves and gone back to the main division, the first division this year, actually. Right, so we're coming to the end of this presentation. The results here they show that there is a big opportunity for Brazilian football clubs to organize themselves because most of them are in big debt. So they have to organize themselves to through an austerity program of reducing cost and expenses. And if that means a temporary worsening of sporting performance, it could be that in the long run, if well managed, it could be they could reap the fruits and manage to resurrect themselves. And also, this means that well-managed teams with better financial results could transform these profits into better sports performance and produce a form of virtuous cycle, like suggested by Baroncelli and Lago when they analyzed Italian football, which in some ways resembles the structure of Brazilian football, as they went through a pretty bad phase there as well. And this scenario in Brazil has been exemplified recently with the examples of Flamengo and Palmeiras. Palmeiras and Flamengo up to 2012, 2013 had massive debts, very big debts in their books. So what they did was they're two of the biggest clubs in Brazil and in the main centers of Brazil. Flamengo is from Rio, the biggest following in Brazil. They have around 40 million fans. And Palmeiras is from São Paulo, in a very good area of São Paulo. Their training center is right in the center. So they had big debts. And what they did is up from 2013, they started cutting expenses, and they did very mediocre teams. They stayed in the middle of the table for lots of years. The administrators were criticized by the fans, by the media, but they managed to pay their debts. And from 2015, 2016, they started investing what they have. So they've started to show gradually profits. And since 2017, Palmeiras and Flamengo have been the two most victorious clubs in Brazil. Palmeiras this week won the Brazilian League. Flamengo last week won the Copa Libertadores. The previous 2 years, Palmeiras won the Copa Libertadores. Flamengo have won quite a few Brazilian leagues in the last few years. And these teams in these last few years, they've always shown profits. And Flamengo, for example, have even had the biggest revenue of the history of Brazilian football, going over 1 billion reais of revenue. And this year, they'll probably go even bigger. And the profits reflect that as well. Flamengo have the biggest profit in Brazil. But it's not always been like that. Like I said, they had quite a few turbulent years with big debts and financial problems. Right, so I'd like here to thank UFOP, which is a university where my master degree was conducted, the post-graduation program in applied economics from UFOP, and also the grant financed by CAPES, which is the institute that finances research, academic research in Brazil. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to me, and I'm open to any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I'm going to make use of the reactions.
Yeah, can I stop sharing?
Round of applause. Yeah, if you want to, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. You can always reshare if it's necessary.
Yeah, exactly. We've got lots of time for questions, so I will invite colleagues in the room to raise their hands and ask questions if they have any. I'll ask a quick one to begin with. You mentioned, I think I might have missed this actually, but in your model you had population for the place where the team was from. I don't know, I mean, are there big income differences across Brazil? And do you know whether that might have an impact on, because obviously a team in a more wealthy area can extract more from its supporters in a wealthy area relative to a less wealthy area, perhaps. I don't know whether you were able to consider that.
Yeah, there absolutely are. Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world, but it's difficult to gather information regarding how that would affect. What I thought about doing was including a attendance variable for stadium attendance. But then again, the difference in stadium capacities varies. And then the other idea was to include how full the stadium was, what was the percentage of the stadium that was full. But then again, this kind of data was not really available for the time frame that was analyzed in the research. And also, as Sanchez used population as an independent variable, we found that it would be better to follow his steps. But I agree, it's something to consider. Maybe using percentage of capacity of the stadium would be ideal.
Yeah, no, I mean, often the data just isn't available. Thanks for that, Thomas. Invite again colleagues to ask questions and pose any comments that they may have. Oh, team says that Sebastian was first ahead of Stefan, but they both appear exactly the same time. So Sebastian first, then Stefan.
Okay, hi. Thanks for the presentation. I have one quick question, or two. In your model, I think I saw that, and maybe you explained it and I missed it, that your R squared is above 1. Did you mention that? Maybe I missed it.
Yeah, what happens is that in the three-stage least squares, the R squared is not really defined, because the sum squared of the residuals sometimes can overtake the total sum of squares. So in the literature, in Wooldridge and in the econometric manuals, the R squared in the three-stage least squares is not really defined. What I think even it was negative, to be honest. Yeah, it was minus 1.8. So I just presented it, but there's not really any statistical significance to this statistic.
I see. And my second question would be, and again, I might have overheard it. Can you tell us a little bit about the instruments you are using?
Yeah.
Was it like left variables, or you mentioned that?
Yeah. So what we used was I researched some other papers from that used three-stage least squares in other areas of economics. And what we found was that usually the use of different lags, and the older the lags, the better. That's what usually the literature says. So we used the third lags of the variables sports performance, cost and expenses, and also the asset lags. So I did a few estimations, a few different estimations, and compared the models to see what instruments were exogenous and what kind of instruments we could be used. And comparing the models, these three instruments were the best.
When you say leg by 3, you mean leg by 3 seasons, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Yes, thanks. I think it's probably very difficult to address this simultaneity, right? And if you try to do that, I think it's valuable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Stefan.
thanks, Thomas. It's really interesting, and so much of the soccer research is based about Europe. It's really great to see some research about Brazil, which is obviously arguably the most important soccer country in the world anyway. So yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. I have a couple of, so I have a sort of some specifics questions and perhaps a broader question. So the specifics really have to do with the nature of the financial data. What is the source of this? Are these audited financial statements? Are they publicly available? Who carried them out? So just a sort of some detail on because in a question, you know, how much can we trust these things? And then the sort of, and relatedly, you know, thinking about a value like assets. I mean, the asset value of a football club is a sort of a tricky thing, right? Because what are really the assets? The stadium, the player contracts, and then the kind of brand value, whatever that might be. You know, so how much would we trust a concept like assets? Loans, when we're talking about debt, are we including soft debt? Do the owners lend money? Who owns these things anyway? I mean, who do they belong to? That's a sort of a background question. And then finally, you know, there's the very broad question. Football's political everywhere, but come on, I mean, in Brazil, it's really, really political, right? And is anybody seriously going to let Corinthians go bankrupt? Or, you know, surely governments will stand in. These people, I mean, this relates to the sort of perhaps the soft budget constraint literature, but is there really any serious financial constraint that these clubs are facing? Can't they just do anything and then someone will bail them out?
Right, that's a really good question, and I might take some time to answer that because it's a bit of a story. First, about the data. Itaú BBA is the corporate branch of Itaú, which is the biggest bank in Brazil, biggest private bank in Brazil. So they started doing this report about the economic and financial analysis of Brazilian football in 2012, 2013. And it was the time where the Congress passed a law which installed a program called Profute, which is a program of modernization and fiscal security of football clubs. And most of the debt of the football clubs were with the federal and state government because they simply wouldn't pay their bills. Like they wouldn't pay their water, electricity bills, or even taxes. But with this program, what the government said was, look, you can pay your debt in the long run, and but for this, you're going to have to do a few things. You're going to have a council inside your club to check the finance. You're going to have to publish statements to with frequency. You're going to have to be subject to some legal consequences, and to in the other hand, this would be for the clubs to install their debts in the long run, something like 30 years. So it was very big debts that would be installed in various in the long run. So most of the clubs adhered this program, and they started publishing their financial statements. So I think, in my opinion, Itaú is a very reliable source. I would compare it with the Deloitte Football Money League report. Of course, Deloitte is a different segment, a different corporation, but the statements are pretty reliable. Regarding the assets question, it's a very tough situation, really, but some clubs can inflate their assets, like say that a player is worth double what he is actually worth, and then the following year let's say the player gets injured, and then he's worth nothing. Let's say the asset could be inflated. That is a risk, but we have to trust the data that we have. That is what I would say. And it could happen in other places as well, like in Britain and in other places in Europe. And now going to who owns these clubs, it's interesting because Brazilian, like I said, Brazilian football clubs, they used to be, they are still non-profit institutions. But recently, a law passed in Congress, in the Senate, enabling clubs to transition from these kinds of institutions to business enterprises, or what is called in Brazil a SAF, which is the Sociedade Anônima do Futebol, which is the anonymous society of football. So some clubs that were in huge debt, which is the case of Cruzeiro, my local team, they transitioned, and the owner of Cruzeiro nowadays, the majority stakeholder, is Ronaldo, the famous Ronaldo. Other clubs have transitioned into this form of enterprise, like Botafogo and also Vasco. Botafogo was sold to John Textor, who is the majority shareholder of Crystal Palace in Britain. But most of the other clubs, not most, all of the other clubs, are political institutions where they have a political council, let's say, or where the members vote for the president, and it's a very weird situation, because you have something that is called political economical cycles. So the last administration usually really spends way more and throws the team in debt and and then the other administration does the same thing. And the story of Cruzeiro, which is nowadays owned by Ronaldo, is pretty much that. Cruzeiro were administration over administration, going into successive losses and massive losses up to 2019, where they had the biggest loss, the biggest financial loss of the history of Brazilian football, something around 300 million reais in the year. So they went into terrible state financially, and we covered it. I covered it very closely because I'm a season ticket holder for Cruzeiro, and it was a situation. They were like 5 months without paying salaries. They went into the second division, and this was 2 years before they beat Flamengo and Corinthians in the final of Copa do Brasil. So they were left in a terrible state, and very few clubs have actually sussed out that if they pay out their debts and manage to produce profits, they can be a big part of the economy and become real powerhouses, like is the case of Flamengo and Palmeiras. Like Corinthians are in big debt, São Paulo are in big debt. Cruzeiro's local rivals, Atlético, they were the champions last year of the cup and the league. They've got the biggest debt of Brazil, but they've got a how can I say, an investor inside the council. So it's, in some ways, it's a tricky situation. Some teams are in a very terrible state. Some teams find investments, some form of investment. Like I said, Brazil is going through a very big transition in football currently, where I think football clubs that suss out the situation and manage to pay out their debts and start making profits will have an advantage in the long run. Did I manage to answer all the questions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the quick suggestion is, I think you should include some political variables in your regressions. I think you need to account for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Sanchez did that as well, but it's a difficult one to ask because all of them in the time scale were political institutions. The law to transition to SAFI was only passed in 2021. So maybe in the future, with this time scale from, I don't know, 2013 and the next few years, where some teams have become business enterprises, I think that would be ideal. But thank you, yeah.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Thomas. Klaus has his hand up with a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for a very interesting presentation here. From my specific theoretical perspective, I think it's quite interesting to hear some of the question and the answer to the last question here, which is, as I see it, evidence of what I would consider soft budget constraints. It's not interesting to hear Stefan providing a quite strong support for that kind of view, as I hear it. But let me ask one thing about your presentation. That
not strong, but
sorry.
I wouldn't say strong. Support, but not strong support.
Support. Yeah. Okay. Then I was absent in the middle of your presentation, so I didn't hear some of the about some of the variables. I couldn't see that there was something about payroll. Was this part of it? So, the relationship between payroll and sport performance. What is the evidence about that?
Yeah, in the literature, most of the evidence has showed that the larger the payroll, the better the sports performance, especially in football. In American sports, due to all the structure of the draft and the salary caps, the relationship is not so direct. But the data for payroll in Brazil was not available. It's interesting that they do not publish these statistics. What they do publish is the total cost and expense of the football club. And I included that in the model in equation 2. And it showed a positive and significant influence of cost and expenses on sporting performance. Yeah, but unfortunately, payroll, they don't really detail. And the only place that you can find it is in the media. And I'm not really confident about putting those, because it could be, there's some sources that I'm not very, let's say they don't publish so many reliable numbers, let's say.
Okay, could I follow up with something? Well, it's very not every day we have a chance to speak to someone from Brazilian presentation, but more general. One is that seen from the perspective of Europe, then Brazil, together with Argentina, is suppliers of players, of top players, and of course, income from sale of players should be an important variable, unless as also evidence of a lot of the brilliant Brazilian players in Europe. European football academies in Europe and so on. So, but I would think, and I want your comment on this, that it's a potential kind of big post of revenue, that sale of players for Brazilian footballers, and clubs that are good at developing players in academies should have a financial advantage that would also then have an impact on sport performance. So that was one point. The other one was I've not been in Brazil since 2003, and I attended a match, the Flamengo match at Maracanã. It was in the end of the season, but I was stunned by the fact in this kind of huge stadium, there were, in a league match, there were about 10,000 people. It was deserted basically, and I thought, wow, this is the biggest club in Brazil, one of world-known clubs with a lot of fans, but still they didn't seem to have a season ticket system that works. There were no kind of razzmatazz around it, apart from a few people playing drums and so on. So it was very, very poor in terms of merchandise, in terms seen from a European point of view. So I guess a lot of progress have made in that respect since then. But I would say, seen from a European point of view, it was very stunning how laggard that even the biggest club in Brazil was about 20 years ago.
You're absolutely correct. Brazil, like I said in the beginning of my presentation, Brazil up to 2000, the year 2000, was a pretty amateur league. It just there was no season tickets. The stadium were the same from the World Cup in the 1950. So it was absolutely in shambles, I'd say. And that is mostly because of the politics of it. The Brazilian administrators didn't want to know about it. They just wanted to make their money. But what happens is, since 2003, a lot has changed. The World Cup modernized that a lot. The stadiums have been refurbished. They've all been gone through a big transformation. Maracanã is not the same stadium that it was in 2003. It's an arena nowadays. I'd compare it. I've been there this year, and in a Cruzeiro and Vasco, and it was packed. And this was in the second division. There were 60,000 people there, and it was a hell of an atmosphere. And these are two of the biggest clubs in Brazil. And that they've been through a big financial situation, still this thing of stadium capacity is very strange, because Flamengo are by far and away the largest average attendance in Brazil. So they've managed to put themselves in a situation that no matter what, they're going to have 50, 60,000 in the stadium. But that is because they have the best team in Brazil. They've got Brazilian internationals. They managed to bring in Arturo Vidal from Inter Milan. They have Davi Luiz, which was playing for Arsenal a few seasons ago. They've got Felipe Luiz, who played for Chelsea and Atletico Madrid a few years ago. So they've got a massive spending power. So the Brazilian fan wants to go and watch good players like anywhere in the world, to be honest. And what happens is that not all clubs have the same spending capacity, because they're in a bit of a financial state. I'd say that apart from Corinthians and Flamengo, most teams only fill their stadiums when they have a good sporting campaign, when they're fighting for going to the continental Libertadores, which is the equivalent of the Champions League, or even if they are fighting for relegation, that fills the stadium up. But in general, teams that are in mid-table and sort of going for Brazilians are not going to go to that to watch that, because the quality is not there. Most of the players are being exported to Europe, like you said in the beginning. Like we can mention loads of examples like Neymar, Vinicius Junior. We have Richarlison, who's playing in Tottenham nowadays, and so on. Casemiro, who plays for Man United, Antony. They all leave the Brazilian football very early. So who stays in Brazilian football are medium players, average players who are not gonna light the world on fire, and veterans in the end of the career. Every now and then you have a special player that everybody sees he's going to be the next big thing, and then in the next year or so, less than a year most of the time, he's sold to Europe. And this is very important. Like you said, Brazil has, again, a very, very big opportunity. Brazilian clubs have a very big opportunity because they have their costs and expenses in Brazilian reais, but they export their players in dollars and pounds and euros, which is a big, big exchange rate. At the moment, $1 is worth 5 reais. So it's a very good opportunity. So if the teams invest in their academy and improve their structure, it's a source of income. It's a massive source of income, and Flamengo are doing that already. They sold recently Vinicius Junior to Real Madrid. They sold Reinier, which is a very young player. He didn't even play that many games, to Borussia Dortmund, and so on. They've got a few players, and they managed to bring in quality players, like I've mentioned. So I think it's a watershed in Brazilian football at the moment, where international investors are going to see this, and they're going to bring in money, like they are bringing in to transform the structure of Brazilian football, for it to become sustainable in the long run. And who knows, in the future, maybe the Brazilian footballers could stay longer in Brazil. Like Neymar, he stayed here for two years and a half, and everybody was amazed. Like when he was 18, 17, he could be playing for Real Madrid or Barcelona. He was dribbling past everybody and scoring goals. You see the goals that he scored in Brazil. Everybody knew that he was going to be the next big thing. The same thing with Vinicius Junior. Everybody knew he would be the next big thing. And there's a player that is already in the spotlight nowadays, which is called Vitor Roque. He's 16 years old, and he plays for Atlético Paranaense. And I'm pretty sure he's going to be the next big thing to go to Europe. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This thing with the academy and the export of young Brazilian footballers is a massive source of income, but it's a way to reduce the interest and the quality of the league, because in some ways nowadays you see young football fans that prefer watching the Premier League or the La Liga or the Champions League, because all the best Brazilian players are simply playing in Europe. So I hope I managed to answer the question.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Klaus. Thanks, Thomas. Stefan, your hand is still up. Is that just from your earlier question, or do you have a follow-up?
Sorry, no, I forgot to put it down. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Any other questions and comments from folk in the audience?
Hi, just a quick question. Excuse me, just a second.
One, yep.
So I was wondering, I mean, the Brazilian case, I think, is very interesting because you have in the same time a kind of exogenous event such as the World Cup, right? So probably you said this, but I missed this point. How did the World Cup event interact with the individual choices of each club in terms of how much to save, how much to invest, etc.? Thank you.
Right, thanks for the question, Guido. So it's interesting because not all the World Cup didn't influence all the football teams in Brazil, because simply for the fact that not all the cities were covered in the World Cup. There were only 12 host cities, and Brazil is, like I said, a very big continental country. So what really happened was, before the World Cup, there was the program that I mentioned, the Profute, which is the program of fiscal management and modernization of the administration of football clubs in Brazil, which happened in 2012. And this really forced clubs, or the professional clubs, to start publishing financial statements and to reduce their financial losses. But then came the World Cup, and what really happened with the World Cup that influenced individual clubs was the modernization of infrastructure. So the training grounds of most football clubs were refurbished because some teams stayed out there. Some national teams stayed at these football grounds, at the training centers, sorry. And also the stadiums. Some stadiums were modernized, and some individual stadiums were modernized. Like in Brazil, some clubs don't really not every club has to own a stadium. There are public stadiums, like is the case here in Belo Horizonte of this Mineirão Stadium. It's owned by the state government of Minas Gerais, and it was all refurbished. It became an arena. But Cruzeiro and Atlético, who are the local teams here, who hold their games there, they were unable to increase their prices in tickets. Like I showed previously, Cruzeiro and Atlético used to play for crowds of 100,000 people, but their income was very small because the tickets were cheap. When I first came to Brazil as a kid, tickets used to cost something like R$1, R$2, which is almost like you would buy tickets with coins, and like the income would be almost nothing. Nowadays, Cruzeiro and Atlético and other teams as well, but I'm focusing on these clubs because they are the ones in the town that I live in. They are earning millions of reais in income just from one football game. The tickets are over 100 reais nowadays. Even if you convert it, deflate the data, you will see that the price increase in Brazilian football, in tickets of Brazilian football, has been massive. Similarly to what happened in Europe as well in the 1980s to the 1990s. And the whole structure was similar, where the stadiums had to be modernized and had to be all seated. Nowadays, most stadiums in Brazil are seated. So that enables clubs to increase the prices and therefore their revenues as well.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks. Thank you.
Guido, thanks, Thomas. Any final questions and comments? In which case, I will echo the comments of Stefan and Klaus and others. It was a fascinating presentation, Thomas. Very interesting to learn about Brazilian football. As you mentioned, something we don't hear about too much here, and surprising in many respects in the development in the last 20 or so years. So thank you very much for that, and we wish you all the best as you develop the paper after your thesis. We will meet again next week on November the 11th, and we have Jean-Louis Fuy from Montpellier in France on how to adjust probability forecasts of football match outcomes in one-legged knockout tournaments with a timely application to the FIFA World Cup, which is starting in 16 days or so in Qatar. So please do join us next week for another talk on football, and I wish you all a fantastic weekend in the meantime, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.